Over the last 7 months, 2 of my friends and I have been working on our first game-making project, which I would describe as an arcade-style Pikmin fan game. In this video, I'll tell you about the ideas behind the project, show you a little bit of our game development process, and then show you what we ended up with. This is my original sketch for the idea, which I drew a couple of years ago after playing the Danger Ba-Bomb Danger minigame from New Super Mario Bros. The gameplay is pretty basic. You just have to move the Ba-Bomb so that it doesn't get hit by any of these obstacles, and the longer the Ba-Bomb survives, the higher your score. This kind of simple concept appealed to me because I wanted to start small in terms of game development. That way, someone like me, who has no experience, could realistically finish the project. Despite having that as a goal, as I fleshed out the design document, I did unknowingly make the game way too complex for what was supposed to be a small practice project, but I'll come back to that later. In short, what I wanted to do was build on top of this basic gameplay by adding more varied obstacles, expanding the player character's moveset, and possibly having different levels. I thought the characters from Pikmin would be a good fit for this because many of them have unique behaviors that would be suited to this type of game. Like, what if we had the Anode Beetle cut off sections of the level with its electricity? Or made shear grubs that gradually eat away at the board, like how they nibble away at bridges. Ideas like that seemed really cool to play with. Also, I just really like Pikmin, so I thought it would be cool to draw the creatures from that series in whatever style the game would end up being in. This is the first version I want to show you, which is only 15 days into development. It has almost all the core features. Bullets spawn from random points off screen with random trajectories. If these touch the player, then the player will take damage. And your score constantly increases over time. One of the enemies that has been implemented so far is the watery blowhog, which shoots a column of water as its attack. The sprite looks strange because the original one I made was too small, so I just stretched it in A-Sprite. That obviously didn't turn out very well. I do think the particle effect that goes with its attack is really cool though. The other enemy is the Anode Beetle, which, like I mentioned before, can cut off sections of the level with its electricity. One more thing you'll notice are these collectibles that randomly spawn on the platform. These are pellets, and collecting them fills this meter, which doesn't actually do anything yet. There are no sound effects yet, but there is one song, which was composed by Merlin. So this version is pretty rough around the edges, particularly the background art. I'm just not that good at making pixel art environments. Speaking of, there is a second level, which is even stranger looking. Don't laugh, okay, but this was meant to be the bridges that they build in Pikmin 1 and 2. Don't ask me why the bridge is surrounded by grass. Anyway though, let's move on to the next version. This is what we had after 81 days of development. A lot of improvements were made to the visuals. The Anode Beetle's animations are much smoother and neater now. We also added this particle effect for when it attacks, which does seem like a good addition, but once it is played, it just loops forever in the same spot, so we eventually just cut that out. The Blowhog has had a very nice overhaul, with more detailed sprite work, and its attack is now fully made of a particle effect, instead of the previous sprite-particle combination. The last visual change I'll show is my second attempt at making a bridge background for one of the alternate levels. I would say it's an improvement, but it doesn't really match well with the other assets. From this point on, we decided to abandon the idea of multiple levels, since they weren't necessary to include in a prototype. The biggest change to the gameplay in this version is that the player can now retaliate against enemies. Using this cursor, you can select an enemy and send some Pikmin to chase them away. This only works if you have filled the pellet meter enough, with each enemy having a specific cost and awarding you a specific number of points. Speaking of, you might have noticed that there is now a third enemy, the bread bug. 2 seconds after a pellet appears, a bread bug will spawn and try to drag it away. You could attack it to stop this, or you could just collect the pellet, causing the bread bug to be disappointed and leave. This enemy does come with one strange issue, or consequence. It allows the player to be pushed out of bounds, which is obviously not intended, but was pretty funny when we discovered it. The last change I'll discuss for this version is that every so often a bullet will spawn that is aimed directly at the player, instead of having a random direction. This inclusion is meant to deter the player from standing still, and for now this type of bullet appears blue, just for testing reasons. So this is what we're calling the final version of the prototype, which was completed after 206 days. And you could see here, instead of showing you this in the Unity editor, instead I am building and running it. Now there is a title screen where you can adjust the game volume with this slider and input your name, which will be used later. I originally meant the song that plays here to be for a waterside level, but since we stopped working on alternate levels, we just put it here. Moving on to the gameplay, the most important change is the new difficulty curve. Before, bullets and enemies would spawn at average rates, but now, bullets and blowhogs both increase in frequency over time, until they reach a certain maximum rate. This gives the game a cool dynamic feel that it didn't have before. In case you were wondering, the anode beetles work differently, but basically all you need to know is that a maximum of 2 can be on screen at once. Speaking of though, we now added an alternate attack for the anode beetle when it is alone. There have been a couple of other balancing tweaks, but just one more that I'll mention is that you can gain an additional hit point when reaching certain score thresholds. One cool addition to the enemies and the rest of the game is the sound effects. Now that many have been added, the player gets more feedback, like when they take damage, or have an insufficient amount of pellets to attack an enemy. Another thing that this does is give the enemies a greater sense of uniqueness because of how distinct they sound from one another. Lastly, when you die, the amount of points you got is recorded in a high score table, and of course the name that displays here is based on the name you input on the title screen. In the end, I'm pretty happy with what we've got so far. The game is much like I originally imagined it when I came up with the basic concept, and more importantly, it's pretty fun to play. With that said, we had a few more ideas for this game, like additional enemy types, another ability for the player, and alternate levels, each with their own gimmicks. As I mentioned briefly in the intro, the intent behind this project was to create a small game so that we could gain the experience of finishing an entire project. In retrospect, to do that, we should have pretty much just made a clone of Danger Bomb Danger, with maybe one new mechanic. But here we are with a prototype that is much more complex, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The only notable downside is that because we just expected this to be for practice, we felt fine using copyrighted characters. Now that we are actually considering releasing the game eventually, we are going to have to change the character designs. Anyway, if you want to see this game get finished and released, found this video interesting, or have some constructive criticism for us, then please feel free to share your thoughts in a comment, or join the channel's Discord server, which is linked in the description. We would really appreciate any feedback you have to give. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.